Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Terp Family Fundamentals webinar series. My name is Danielle Walker, and I'm the program coordinator in the Office of Parent and Family Affairs here at Maryland. For those of you that are new, this webinar series is intended to help you become informed consultants on campus resources so that you can be a better support for your Terp. Today, we're joined by staff in the Office of Off-Campus Housing Services. They'll discuss off-campus housing options, timelines, and also tips for navigating this decision with your Terp. We received many questions through your registration, and we hope to be able to answer most of those throughout this presentation. If you find that you still have questions, please feel free to submit those via the Q&A feature. To access the Q&A feature, find the conversation bubbles towards the bottom of your screen. It should also say Q&A under that. If you don't see that, you may need to click on the three dots to expand the toolbar. To help us answer questions that the majority of you have, I do ask that you use the upvote option. Within the Q&A feature, if you see a question that you would also like the answer to as well, instead of typing the same question, click the thumbs up icon. This is called an upvote, and I will be prioritizing the questions with the most upvotes. Also, be sure to look at the answered tab as well for questions that have already been responded to. We'll do our best to respond to as many questions as we can before the end of this webinar. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel tomorrow. With that, I'll hand off the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Lindstrom, and I'm the manager for housing partnerships in the Department of Resident Life. What that means is that I wear two hats. I oversee eligibility and priority for leasing in our public-private partnerships, and I also oversee the Off-Campus Housing Services Office, which provides resources for students who are looking for off-campus housing. So we're going to talk today a little bit about how to navigate the off-campus housing with your Terp. Hopefully I'll get a lot of questions answered in the presentation, but like Danielle said, please feel free to drop your question in the Q&A and we can answer when I'm finished. All right, let's get started. All right, I already said hello, so we'll go to the next one. So I'm going to talk about off-campus housing at University of Maryland, the housing options, a tiny bit about a timeline, and I'm going to spend probably the bulk talking about our public-private partnerships because that's really the season we're in right now. I have some suggestions about what to talk about with your Terp regarding off-campus housing, and then I'll cover some frequently asked questions that we often get. So there's three main types of off-campus housing in College Park. We have public-private partnerships, we have apartment complexes, and individual houses that individual landlords rent. The public-private partnerships are South Campus Commons and the Courtyards and are managed by a private company called Capstone On-Campus Management. As far as apartments, there's 12 plus options in college, just in the immediate College Park area. If you've been to College Park recently, you'll see a lot of cranes in the air, building a lot more student housing. So there's much more to come in the future. And then houses can be found all over College Park in walking distance, just to the east of campus or to the north of campus, and even the south of campus. And then actually I live in North College Park in Hollywood, and I have a rental house next door to me. So there's lots of options involving rental options in College Park. And we also have a really robust bus system, the shuttle system that can get your Terp anywhere they want to go. I'm also going to, we also tend to talk about subleasing and releasing. This is both for fall and for spring housing. So if a student is wanting to wait to make decisions for their fall or spring housing, sometimes subleasing and releasing is a good opportunity for your Terp. Like I said, students have a lot of choices when they move off campus. The typical housing search has a really long range. You'll start to see off-campus housing properties advertising in October for the following fall. That's might be too early for some folks, especially if you're new to campus and you're still trying to get your way around, find your way around. But students are finding housing all the way up through June and beyond. Typically after June and July, we're looking more at subleasing and releasing, but it really depends on what type of housing you're looking for. The large managed properties tend to run on that same kind of early, like October to November starting point. Whereas with houses, landlords for houses will list almost any time of the year. And then leasing for South Campus Commons and the Courtyards, if you're going through the traditional release or traditional leasing process, which we call open leasing, that application goes live in November, and then selection happens towards the end of March. And then if you ever have trouble looking for things, you can always give us a call and we'll help you navigate things. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about Commons and Courtyards. That is our public-private partnership. And what that partnership means is that the university owns the land that the buildings are on, and a private company manages those properties. Both communities have resident assistants who provide community programming. They also have mixed gender options if your resident wants to live with a friend of a different gender. The apartments on South Campus Commons, the RAs in those properties are actually employed directly by the University of Maryland. And in the Courtyards, they're employed directly by Capstone on-campus management, but they all receive the same training in the spring semester. Both properties have 11.25 months leases, and that is pretty typical for off-campus housing, 11.25 to 11.5 month leases. For Commons and Courtyards, priority is given to on-campus rising juniors for first priority and also being pulled in. The pull-in process has already ended. And so now we're starting to move into the open leasing process. And I'm actually having, at 5 o'clock today, we have an info session about open leasing. I think Danielle is going to share the link to that. If you have a student on campus right now, they should have gotten an email from me yesterday with that link as well. So you can see on this map where they're located. South Campus Commons is basically right on campus. It's not considered on-campus housing for financial purposes, but you're right adjacent to a lot of our on-campus residence halls. And the Courtyards is just north of campus beyond the Xfinity Center, just off of 193. And there is a university shuttle that regularly stops at the Courtyards. So as we're looking at open leasing, right now students are in the process of applying. I forgot to update this slide. So the leasing application is actually on the StarRes housing portal. If your student lives on campus or has been on the Resident Life website, they're familiar with the login button. If you click that login button, it'll take you to the StarRes housing portal, and that's where they can fill out the 2021-2022 South Campus Commons and Courtyards leasing application. If a student fills out the leasing application, they're not obligated to sign a lease. This is to basically just get them in the queue. The deadline for that is March 1st. And and after that date, I'll be sending out a lot more information. So that if this is an option your student is interested in, they'll really want to pay attention to their email between starting March 2nd, honestly. There's going to be a lot coming at them between March 2nd and March 1st and spring break. So we'll be giving, after the leasing application closes, we'll send out leasing appointments and students will be able to form groups in the system. And then the open leasing process itself will happen March 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. To be eligible to live in South Campus Commons and the Courtyards and go through open leasing, you have to be a full-time, currently registered undergrad at University of Maryland. So you have to be registered for the spring semester. So if your student has a friend that's transferring in the fall, they would not be eligible to go through the open leasing process because they're not a current student. And then they must be in good standing judicially, financially, and academically. Most students are in good standing. If there's any questions about judicial, they should reach out to either student conduct or the Rights and Responsibilities Office in Resident Life. For financial eligibility, they can reach out to the Financial Aid Office. And for academic eligibility, typically students know if they're academically eligible or not. Most students who are not academically eligible aren't actually registered. So that's a pretty simple one. So one thing to really understand about both the public-private partnerships and other off-campus options is that your student will be signing a lease, and there's really no getting out of it unless they transfer to another student. So this is just really important to understand. Typically, students living in the residence halls, it's a little bit more flexible if they want to switch rooms and things like that. But with leases, as you probably know, if you've leased before, they're even in student housing, they're not as flexible as it is on campus. So it's just something to keep in mind. If your student wants to live off campus but isn't quite ready to cook for themselves, there's a lot of options that are offered from dining services. You can just go to dining.umd.edu and look at the different off-campus dining plans. And then, like I had mentioned before, the shuttle system is really helpful for if your student does want to go grocery shopping or get around town without a car. Something to note, at Courtyards, they do offer free parking on the property. It doesn't give you free parking on campus, but if your student has a car and wants to use it for grocery stores or things like that, they will have free parking. So the priority order has changed a little bit for this year. The priority order is the order in which students get to select their housing through open leasing. The first priority has not changed. It has always been on-campus rising juniors. On-campus rising juniors typically have first priority because they're not guaranteed on-campus housing for their junior year. We really only guarantee it for the first and second year, and that's in a normal year. COVID has changed everything. And the second priority group is going to be on-campus rising sophomores. Typically, on-campus rising sophomores are in the third priority group. But because of the reduced numbers on campus, we're giving them a little bit more help to stay kind of within the purview of residence life. Third will be on-campus rising seniors, then fifth years, and then in the fifth year group is off-campus students. The reason that it's important to understand the priority order is that if your student has friends that are in different priority groups, that will affect when they get to select their apartment. So if they group up, if they're in the first priority and they have a friend that's in the third priority, the appointment will actually go to the third priority group. So basically the person in the first priority will have to wait until after the first and second priority groups have gone and then lease with the third priority group. And I'm going to go over this also in tonight's info session at 5 o'clock. If your student is, with COVID, we're not quite sure what the future holds all the time. So if you're not ready to lease during open leasing in March and want to give it a little bit more time, we always have a number of students in the fall who changed their mind. They sign a lease either as a returning student in February or as a new student in March, and then things change. So in the fall, they may find out that they don't need their lease anymore. So they're able to legally transfer that lease to another student through the re-leasing process. And that's all handled through my office and Capstone. Students have to fill out a re-leasing form, and then we handle that. But that's basically the process for picking up a lease later in the year. And that would honestly be the same for any other off-campus property. Most off-campus properties these days are doing re-leases instead of subleases because I think it kind of takes out some confusion. Within a sublease, if I was the leaseholder and I needed somebody to stay in my place so I don't have to pay rent, I would still be legally bound to that lease. But with re-leasing, that it's a legal transfer to the other person. So once I transfer that, I wouldn't have to worry about the legality of that lease as far as it pertains to me. Re-leasing is only offered between the 4th and 20th of each month. That's so that they can do some work on either end, the leasing staff. And then they also pause it for August, February, and March because those are big transition times, whether it's for people moving out and cleaning and moving back in, or for the open leasing season. So going to more generally off campus, like I had mentioned, there's a lot of apartment housing options in the immediate area, surrounding, almost touching campus, and then even within a mile or 2 miles, there's a huge amount of opportunities to lease in apartments. Everything's handled through the individual leasing offices. My office does not handle leases at all. We are not in charge of any properties. We really just offer the resources to help people find them. So if you're interested in signing a lease at an off-campus property that's not commons or courtyards, you can reach out directly to that property to find out availability and to sign that lease. And then anytime you're living off campus, this includes the public-private partnerships, the rent is due to the property and not the university. So that's a big change too. When students live on campus, all the bills come into your university bill and you pay it however you pay it and you're done. But when it comes to paying for off-campus housing, that's going to be a separate check or bank draft or credit card that you handle separately. When it comes to financial aid, in general, financial aid can be applied because I think it's supposed to go towards the cost of attending university, which housing is part of that. So if you have your just federal loans come in, what will happen is that's dispersed to the university, and then they'll take out what the amount that needs to cover tuition and fees. And then the lump sum that's left over can be refunded back to the student, and that can be used to pay for their rental installments. I know there's questions about 529s and Parent Plus loans, and that's the best people to ask about those, about how to apply that to off-campus housing is the financial aid office. So I know that question will come up, but I'm going to direct you to the financial aid office. And if you have any kind of private loans or things like that, I would reach out to them as well, just to make sure that you're getting the proper answer to your individual situation. All right, I know that was a lot of information. You can all take a breath, and then I'm going to share some information about what to bring up with your Terp when they're thinking about their off-campus options. So basically, I have a lot of questions that you can ask them. It's important to know what their priorities are. Are they planning to study abroad at any point during the school year? Are they graduating? Those two questions are important to know because of that 11.25 month lease. If a student needs to leave for any reason mid-lease, they are likely to have to find somebody to take over that lease through the releasing process or subleasing, depending on what that property offers. Also, what kind of housing? Do they want a yard? If that's the case, they might want to look at a private house. If they want a furnished apartment that they just have to move their clothes into, one of those larger apartment complexes might be a better fit. Thinking about rent, whether they're going to have a job or things will come out of the rent will come out of financial aid is important because you'll want to include that on your FAFSA. Whether or not you want roommates or housemates is really important because we have resources on the OCH database, which is our housing search database where students can connect with other roommates. And then also getting around is important. Do they need to have a car? If that's the case, do they want to be able to park on campus or just park at their property? Because that affects the rent payments. A lot of properties have on-site parking, but there's usually a premium you have to pay for that. And also during breaks. In the summertime, a lot of students still have a couple months left of their lease. And so a lot of times students will find another student to take over during that time so that they can have an internship or go home or whatever and not have to pay for a place where they're not going to be living. So these are really important things to think about. I think also like where class is going to be is also an important question because that might determine which property they want to live on, like which side of campus, things like that. So taking out a map and really looking at it at the campus as a whole is really helpful when you're trying to decide what the best options are. Another big conversation is expenses. It's not always cheap to live in College Park. There's some beautiful buildings in College Park, and they also come with quite a price tag. So that's really, I think sometimes students get attracted to the pretty things and don't always think about the nuts and bolts. So that's a really important question to have if you're wanting to be a little more frugal in your off-campus housing. Typically, when it comes to rent, houses are a better option because usually there can be up to 5 people in a house, and usually it's the rent for the whole house that they divvy up. But in a lot of the off-campus properties and the big apartment buildings, they have individual leases or what we call a by the bed lease. where the student shares a space with other students, but they only sign a lease for themselves. So they might be in a 4-bedroom apartment, each paying, $1,000. Whereas in a house, that maybe there's 5 people and they're paying that same $4,000 as a total and divvying that up. So rent can be complicated when you're thinking about houses, when you're just trying to find the most affordable options. But typically houses are going to bring that affordability. If you live a little bit away from campus, that usually increases the affordability as well. As far as the public-private partnerships go, Courtyards, I think, has to be the best deal in town. I'm maybe a little biased because I work so closely with them, but looking at prices around, I've seen Courtyards offers the most amenities and space for the lowest price. I think it's a beautiful community personally. Doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it has enough, I think, for students to be happy. Most off-campus apartments include utilities. Sometimes they include some utilities and not others. So that's an important question to ask when you're looking as far as when you're considering your expenses. Again, I mentioned parking. Students who live off campus can get parking on campus, but it's not cheap. And sometimes the location a student might get on campus might not really be all that helpful. A lot of off-campus students will park by the Xfinity Center, and that might be farther than walking from your apartment. If your student's interested in South Campus Commons, there is a garage right there, Moat Lane Garage, but you'd want to talk to Dots about how to get in that garage. Of course, food, if they want to have a dining plan versus shopping. Thankfully, there's a lot of great shopping grocery stores around College Park now. It used to be a bit of a food desert, but we have a Lidl store now, which is really affordable. And then there's Whole Foods, which isn't always as affordable, but delicious. So there's a lot of great options for groceries as well. And then any other expenses you can think of, maybe having to pay for cable. If it's a place that doesn't have furniture, do you want to rent furniture or buy furniture? So it's a lot to think about when you're considering the expenses. And we actually have a worksheet that you can use on the OCH website to help figure out some of your expenses. People regularly ask me when they should start looking. I don't have a good answer for that because it really depends on how comfortable / how nervous you or your student might be about finding housing. If you want to just have it done as soon as possible, I would look to an off-campus property that's starting their leasing in November, if that makes you comfortable. But students also find housing all the way up until August. That might be too late or feel too late for some folks. So you kind of want to use your gut to say, at what point do I know I want to make sure my student is settled with their housing for the fall? And then kind of work from there. Like I said, leasing in South Campus Commons and the Courtyards happens in March. Some folks think that's late. But then with transfer students, they're oftentimes not coming in until after that and still finding housing. So that might be a conversation to have with your student. Length of lease, it's pretty rare to find any properties that allow less than 11 months. You're going to probably look farther off campus for that. And usually there's a premium attached to that, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, anything less than 12. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about the OCH database and how to find housing. Actually, that might be a frequent asked question. So the biggest, we get the questions about how do I find housing? My office has a database. It's called the OCH database. We're very clever. And it is a wonderful site that you can use to search for housing. There's a number of search parameters. There's a map function, which I actually find to be one of the more useful ways of searching, is just to kind of move the map around to where you're interested in living if you're familiar with the area. It also has a roommate finder, and that's the roommate finder can only be used by people who have the university login. So it's only going to be university people using that roommate finder. But if you don't have a building in mind off the top of your head, that's a great place to look. My office also has an off-campus housing fair each year. I'm working on scheduling it. I believe it's going to be on April 21st. I just have to finalize some things. But that's another option that gives it where it's going to be online, where you can talk to a lot of different properties, in an hour or two, rather than having to go to each property or call them. So we'll send out more information on that once we have links and more dates finalized. Mentioned commons and courtyards. The main way people get in is through open leasing. Secondary way is through re-leasing. We talked about scholarships. If it's not a federal financial aid, I would just ask the financial aid office if it's covered. And then getting around is always important. College Park, thankfully, is very walkable and bikeable. It's becoming even more so with some of the construction that's happening on Route 1. But there's a lot of public transportation, including the metro system, metro buses, and of course the UMD shuttle system, which I have ridden for years and have always been very happy with where it takes me. Talking about studying abroad and planning ahead. Whenever you're thinking about off-campus housing, you really almost want to think at least a semester ahead of wherever you're going to be, just because of study abroad planning or even graduation. The earlier you know what you're going to be doing, particularly if it means needing to move away, the better, because you can advertise that space for release or sublease, and hopefully get it taken before you have to go anywhere. For most students, this is going to be the first time they've been signing a lease. We have some resources, and we have a resources book on our OCH website, which is och.umd.edu. So there's a handout there that covers like some terminology and things to make sure it includes. But if you really want to make sure that the lease is good and proper, you can reach out to the undergrad legal aid office, and they'll read over the lease just to make sure that everything is on the up and up. We already talked about when to look, but again, I say soon in this, but really go with whatever makes you comfortable. If you or your student isn't ready to do it right now or isn't ready to do it in April, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And we're here to help you navigate that process, answer any questions. I've virtually held hands during this process. So just let us know what you need and we'll do our best to help you out. Some last minute resources. I put the link to the info session that's happening today. Again, it's at 5 o'clock. My office's website is och.umd.edu. There's a link to the database there as well. And then if you're interested in South Campus Commons or the Courtyards, you can go directly to their websites. I know they have virtual tours up there so you can see what's going on. Feel free to call us or email us. The PPP leasing email is used specifically to discuss matters involving our public-private partnerships. And then the OCH covers more general, we respond to more general questions about housing, off-campus housing. And then for the other properties, they all have websites. So if you are looking for really specific information about like a larger property, check out their website and reach out to them. They all run a little bit differently, and we just can't keep up with that. So it's always best to go to the source. Thank you so much. I know I probably filled your head with lots of information. This is going to be recorded, so you can go back and play it slowly. I know I talk fast, but I'm happy to answer questions now.
Great, thank you. So the first question is from Kim. She asks about students who opted out of on-campus housing this semester. And so does this impact their status or priority when it comes to the PPPs?
That depends. For students who had a fall 2020 assignment and canceled by August 12th and didn't move in, well, canceled for August 12th and then didn't live on campus at all this year, you would retain on-campus standing for the purposes of public-private partnerships. If a student, obviously if you're living on campus this spring, you have on-campus eligibility. And if you did not have an assignment for fall, but received one for spring and canceled, you would also have eligibility. But if you did not have have any assignments for on-campus housing this year, you would be in the off-campus priority group.
Thank you. The next question from Tamara is, what would be the reason for a rising sophomore to choose off-campus housing instead of on-campus?
I can give my personal reason. I think sometimes students think that they're grown after their first year of college and want to get off campus and be grown. If the option is there, I always encourage students to stay on campus for their sophomore year just because they're still developing. I mean, COVID year in particular, I think it's nice to get that extra year of just getting used to things. Sometimes sophomores they have different needs. Maybe they want to cook for themselves. Maybe they want to save money by living maybe a little bit further away from campus, things like that. I think there's a lot of reasons that students would choose a rising sophomore would choose off campus. But I think a lot of it is like, they live in traditional housing, which I mean, I did. And then I think sometimes they get distracted by off campus and aren't always aware that there's similar options on campus. That's something that I'm really trying to do. Is this year I haven't been able to do it, but last year I went around to all the different residence halls so I could be available to answer questions specifically of the current freshmen rising sophomores. A lot of them that I talked to didn't know that there were apartments in the on-campus housing system on South Campus. So some of it is just lack of knowledge about what their options are for their sophomore year. And then sometimes it's just having different needs. I should do a survey probably at some point. That'd be interesting.
Thank you for that. I agree. When I was in school, I actually stayed on campus all 4 years because that was allowed on my campus. And I really benefited from it. So if your student can live on campus, I would suggest they live on campus as long as they can. The next question, for South Campus Commons, would they have to be currently registered as full-time in spring 2021?
They have to be registered. We ask that they be full-time when they have their leases, but to participate in open leasing, they just have to be registered.
Thank you. So you spoke a little bit about the priority of different years, but if there is, say there's some sophomores in the group and then there's one student who didn't live on campus at all, does that move the priority to off-campus housing?
Yes. Individual students always retain their priority. So if they're looking by themselves, they'll have their priority. But once they start grouping up, that's when things change. So everybody will have an appointment. So, so the group 1 people will have earlier appointments. The group 5 people will have later appointments. But once they group up, the earlier appointments don't matter anymore because they have to attend the appointment of whoever has the latest, whoever is in the lowest group, basically. And it's in that order. So I always explain it, if you think about a line, people in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th priority group can't cut in line in front of the first priority group. People in the 5th can't cut in line in front of the people in front of them. So that's why the people in the front have to move the back to the back if they want to partner up. Hope that makes sense. I have a good graphic on a presentation later on.
That absolutely makes sense. The next question is regarding dining. And so are there dining options all year for PPPs or just when University of Maryland is in session?
That's a great question. I think it changes. The dining halls do close. I believe this is probably a better question for dining. But within their, some of the dining plans, they have money that they can spend at the local convenience stores around. So if somebody's, in an apartment and the dining hall's closed, they can go get a frozen pizza or something like that. But I would actually check out, I don't know what the timing of dining halls opening and closing is, but that should be on the dining services website.
Thank you. So when it comes to PPPs, are there single room apartments or are they all multi-room units?
So in South Campus Commons, they do have a studio option and a 1-bedroom option, but they are very few and far between. And typically returning residents will snatch them up before they can even make it to open leasing. The intent process for current residents started in January, ended on Monday. So students, when they're already living there, they can select to stay in the same bed, or they can select a transfer. So if any of those spaces open up, usually the students who select a transfer will pick them up and they never show up for open leasing. But in South Campus Commons and right now in Courtyards, all the bedrooms are individual, so there's no shared bedrooms, but then there's anywhere from 2 to 4 people in each apartment.
Thank you. One person asked if you could put the last slide back up just so they can see the addresses. And for folks who haven't opened the chat, I did provide a link to the student info session that's tonight at 5 o'clock, as well as the OCH database, which is where you can find housing options and the roommate finder. And then there's also the OCH website link that has tons of resources up at the top. If you click on resources, there's a ton of information there as well. So those links are in the chat, and I will share those again in just a second. Can you talk about whether the PPPs, do they have RAs? Do they have any type of support like that, similar to what on-campus housing has?
Yeah, South Campus Commons and the Courtyards both have RAs on staff, and they both are part of the duty system. South Campus Commons is more affiliated with the on-campus world, where the community director, resident directors, and RAs are all directly employed by the Department of Resident Life. So they fall under the resident life duty system, whereas the Courtyards has their own resident assistants and resident directors, and they're employed directly by Capstone on-campus management. And then there's an overall duty system that covers the properties. So there's multiple levels of people that are involved in that system. So both for safety, but then the RAs are also there to help build community and things like that.
Perfect. And then our last question, oh, where did it go? Sorry, they moved around. It was about availability in the PPPs. So do you know if they plan to be at full capacity for fall, or will they be limiting that due to COVID restrictions?
For the PPPs?
Yes.
Basically all apartments are at full capacity because there's no shared rooms. So even on campus where they, like in an apartment or a suite where they would normally share bedrooms, those are also individual right now. But all off-campus properties, including our PPPs, they're as full as they can be. I don't think any of them are completely full because people, opted out. They didn't opt out. They either chose not to live there or were able to get their leases canceled. But yeah, I believe going forward in the fall, they'll continue to be at capacity. And that's really because of how they're set up. There's no communal bathrooms that they're sharing. You're only sharing a bathroom with up to one other person. So they're just the way they're set up is a little bit different. So those will stay at capacity. I don't know what on-campus housing is going to look like in the fall, but yeah, off-campus is, they're running as usual. The only major change that I found was in Courtyards. They used to have a quad option, which meant a 2-bedroom, 2-bath deluxe apartment where the bedrooms were shared by 2 people. So it was basically a 4x2. It was 4 people in a 2-bedroom, but they stopped doing that this year due to COVID, just so that students could physically distance a little bit better.
Great, thank you so much. So there are many questions still in the Q&A feature, and we're not going to be able to get to those just due to time, but I will pull a report of these and try to get answers for you all, and then send a PDF with the answers, as well as let you know when the recording of this webinar will be on the Terp Family YouTube channel. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us this afternoon. Definitely take down the contact information you see on this slide here for off-campus housing if you do have questions that you want to send to them directly. I hope you found this information helpful as you navigate the off-campus housing search. I know it can be somewhat daunting, but you have a whole team here willing to support you and help you in this. So contact information for them is on this last slide. So please reach out to them if you have any questions. As I bring this webinar to a close, I want to remind everyone that a recording of this webinar will be available on the Terp Family YouTube channel tomorrow. You'll receive an email with a link to the recording, as well as a survey. So please let us know how we did, how we can improve on future webinars, and any other topics you'd be interested in learning more about. I thoroughly enjoy connecting with campus partners, and so giving me the opportunity to do that and bring information to you is always welcome. We welcome your thoughts on this survey, and so thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.